Welcome back. So what we're doing here is thinking about the determinants of state scope. We've already thought a little bit about what the state should do when it comes to the market, right? We've talked about how perhaps the state should step in when there are market failures. But here we're turning away from that normative question to the more empirical question of just what does state scope look like? How has it changed over the 20th century? And in particular, what does the scope of the US state look like? How big is that? So to start thinking about this, let's think about where we actually see the state doing a lot in real life. Now, first of all, we have to start with the sort of main reason for the existence of the state according to Hobbes and Tilley, and that of course is the idea of providing public defense and providing law and order and safety for everybody, overcoming that problem of anarchy and providing the public good of public safety. Well, we also talked about the public good of a well-educated populace, and of course here we see our beautiful campus here at Fort Lewis, a state-run public education that is very important for providing lots of positive externalities associated with a well-educated populace. Now, another thing that the state does that really helps the market thrive, that really helps most of its citizens live good lives, is provide all sorts of infrastructure. The built environment that we live in has the state all over it, from the sidewalks and roads to power lines. We really see the state having a primary role in providing infrastructure that we all use, individuals and businesses alike. The state will also step in and provide R&D, or research and development. Now, of course, this is also something that private industries do, but the state often will step in places where we need research and development that might not be as profitable for individual firms. And so we see the National Institutes for Health, the National Science Foundation here in the United States doing tons of research, not to mention the research done by the Department of Defense or by NASA, right, that have led to a lot of really powerful things that we use in our everyday lives. Now, then we get a little bit more controversial when we start talking about the issue of social welfare. And in other words, should the state step in and smooth inequality? Should the state provide for people who are in need? A related topic would be healthcare. Should the state provide healthcare to its public? And that's going to be something that we are going to think a lot about as we really sink our teeth into the issue of healthcare reform, which of course remains perhaps one of the biggest issues in the United States today, and that's why we're going to think about it a lot. But again, empirically speaking, where do we see the state? We see the state a lot in our lives. And in a lot of these spheres of state influence and even beyond, we see the state doing a lot of work. Well, the state has grown pretty dramatically over the course of the 20th century. And so pretty much across the world, the state used to not deal in a lot of the issues that it currently deals in. Modern welfare states, public education systems being all over the world. These are somewhat new issues, and we have a lot of reasons for this. And probably the biggest reason, and here we have a little bit of World War II propaganda. Sow the seeds of victory. Planting a victory garden, every garden and ammunition plant. This is the state stepping in. The state as embodied by Lady Liberty, right? Stepping in here to say, people, you need to garden, we have shortages. This is going to help us win the war. And indeed, World War II really saw an enormous expansion of the state. The state, both here in the United States and in other countries, doing a lot more than it had before World War II, because this was an all-out battle for survival. And so people sort of allowed the state to do whatever it needed to do because of that existential threat, the idea that if we didn't win this war, we would be ruined. Well, so we saw the state all over the world expand in scope a lot during World War II, and in most places it didn't really shrink after that. So it was able to sort of keep its size. It never really returned to its pre-war smaller scope. It's also been asked to just adjudicate a lot more in a lot of societies, from financial crises to dealing with different legal issues that are arising. We've seen that there are just more issues that states are demanded upon. We also see that the relative size of the state is often partially explained by the ideology of that state. And so remember, we can look back at our big classic ideologies from liberalism to classic conservatism to communism and socialism. These ideologies give us very different normative statements about what the state should do, what the good society is, and of course, as well, they give us empirical statements about how to get to that desired society that the ideology prizes so much. So let's look at some data on StateScope, and these are some data from your textbook. And we're measuring here, we're measuring StateScope here by the percentage of the GDP that is spent by the government. And so GDP is gross domestic product, and this sounds sort of easy. It's the size of the entire economy. It's actually a really hard thing to measure, and it's a contentious debate. How do you measure GDP? But this is one very standard measure of GDP, and it's showing us the percentage of all of the economic activity in a state that is actually through the government, through the state. And so you see in Sweden, which has a very broad state scope, a very large state, they have a little more than half of all of the economic activity in the state occurring by the state itself. So 52% of the Swedish economy is actually run through the state in the form of taxing and state spending. The United States has about 38%, according to these data. 38% of the economic activity in the United States is run by the governments of the states and the federal government. And then, of course, we see the numbers going down. And one thing I think you would see really quickly as you look at this and we say, okay, we've got Sweden and the United States with the largest state scope, and we've got these countries having sort of lower and lower levels of state scope. Well, one thing that jumps out at us is that the wealth of the state is a really important variable for understanding the scope of the state. Basically, a wealthier society will have a wider state scope. Wealthier states are able to do more. And so if the society is wealthier, the state is able to extract more in the form of taxes, and the state is able to do more in the form of providing public goods, education, infrastructure, etc. So perhaps the best way to understand empirically how big is a state is simply how much does the state have in terms of monetary resources? How wealthy is that state? Another important thing is type of regime, and so we're not going to worry about this too much now, but our next unit is going to be all about regime type. And here what we mean are sort of the broadest patterns of interactions between society and the state. And another way to put that is the state democratic or not, essentially, is what we're going to talk about. And one way that democracies are different is that they typically have more state scope. They typically do more. And that makes sense because democracy is ruled by the people. The people are able to provide input onto what their states do, and so people will demand more of their state where they are able to hold their leaders accountable democratically. Ideology, as I mentioned, can help us understand, and of course if we look at Sweden, which has had a pretty vibrant socialist ideology, and we look at the United States, which has this classically liberal ideology, really very much focused upon allowing the free market to work to the greatest extent possible and keeping the state as small as possible, we see that these two relatively equal countries in terms of their wealth and their regime type, they're both wealthy democracies, well, their scope varies. And one reason for that could be ideology. A final major variable that helps us understand how large the state actually is in different societies is its geopolitical neighborhood. And by that I mean basically, are you Israel, which is a small country surrounded by countries that see Israel as an enemy, perhaps? And that would mean that they have pretty high state scope in order to deal with that threat. Think again of World War II being a major reason that the state scope expanded in the first place. Countries like Israel or like South Korea, who are in very dangerous geopolitical neighborhoods, meaning they are in neighborhoods that are very unsafe for them, that there's always sort of a threat, they will often have wider state scopes. So here we're going to think about the scope of the U.S. state. And here is a little screenshot of the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP. This is a form of social provision or welfare, right? Providing people with lower incomes resources to get food. And this is, of course, something that some people think should not happen, some people think should happen more, but this is sort of the cutting edge of the U.S. state, of the scope of the U.S. state. And so as you think about this, is it larger or smaller than the average state? Well, the idea of our classically liberal ideology is a smaller state, because the idea is restricting what the state does. If you think about, remember when we read the U.S. Bill of Rights, all the state shall not do this, the state shall not do that. And so the idea of the United States is to have this classic liberalism which restricts the size of the state. However, some people would argue that this is not the case. Well, we saw that the United States has about 38% of its GDP going through the state. That's a lot higher than a lot of countries. And we've grown alongside other states, alongside other democracies over the 20th century. But we still have a comparatively smaller state than a lot of other advanced industrialized democracies, particularly if you compare the US state to a lot of those European states. However, maybe not by much. And so if you just look at the measure of percentage of GDP spent by the state, yes, it does look like the United States has a lower state scope than a lot of its advanced industrial peers. However, this does not always capture the scope of the state. And that's the argument made by this man, Howard, and he argues that the United States has as large of a state as a place like Sweden or a place like France. And the argument is based upon tax deductions. So while the United States is not going out and spending, it certainly is providing a lot of tax deductions to different interests. So for example, you can deduct anything you give to a charity on your taxes, and that's basically the government giving you money for a certain behavior. You can deduct interest on your mortgage, and this is something that we just bought a house in my family, and it is a really big difference. And it's not necessarily fair that I get to deduct most of what I paid in my mortgage right now because I'm mostly paying interest. I get to basically write that off. Whereas last year when I was renting a house, I certainly was not able to get any tax benefits for renting. The idea that Howard is saying is that actually if you look at things like these deductions for mortgage interest, student loan interest, charitable giving, this is actually the United States being very active. And in a way you can see the US state being equally large, perhaps arguably, to those European states. So just a little bit of food for thought. Thank you for joining me for this lecture. I'll see you next time. Have a great day.